Welcome to today's webinar, Evolve Beyond the Third Line, Integrating Audit and Risk for Greater Agility, Visibility, and Effectiveness. Today's discussion is presented by Iceberg and RSA. My name is Glenn Gower. I'm from Iceberg, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Joining me are two panelists. Patrick Potter has spent over 25 years leading internal audit, business resiliency, strategic planning, and related activities at Fortune 500 companies, and he is currently a GRC strategist and subject matter expert for audit management and business resiliency for RSA Archer. He joins us today from Phoenix, Arizona. Welcome, Patrick.
Thanks, Glenn.
And Kirk Hogan is a senior consultant and the chief operating officer at Iceberg with over 2 decades of experience in security and risk management. Kirk has developed and implemented GRC programs for dozens of government organizations and enterprises in North America. And Kirk is with me today here in Ottawa, Ontario. Welcome, Kirk.
Thanks, Glenn.
So today's presentation is going to be a conversation in 3 parts. Kirk and Patrick will be diving into a number of topics to offer insight into what are today's internal audit challenges and why these challenges exist, and then how can we evolve in order to address and overcome some of those challenges. Throughout the call today, we do invite our audience to submit any questions you may have via the chat panel on your WebEx screen, and we'll answer as many as we can during the webinar. I should also mention that we'll be posting this slide deck as well as the full webinar video to our website, and we'll share that link with everyone once everything's online. That'll be later on today. So let's jump into the first section. And Patrick, I'll turn it over to you. I want to start with the challenges. Can you walk us through some of the key challenges for internal audit today?
Yeah, sure. So, I think the first one is, as we show these bullets here, is the rapidly changing risk environment. I look back, as you read through our bio, as Kirk and I have been doing audits for a lot of years, and I look back, even 10 years ago, and I don't think there's the level or magnitude of risks that we see today. When I think about some that the audit groups have to evaluate, IT risks, for example, cyber breaches, Internet of Things, cloud, mobile, the natural disasters, that have occurred in 2017 around the world. Audit has concern over those. Financial, banking, trading, fraud risks. I know you show a slide in a little bit, but there's a statistic that one of the studies talked about one of the greatest challenges to internal audit is the effectiveness of the organization's risk management program, not just within the audit group itself, but the operational risk program. So that's a concern, not only the risks that are coming, but just the ability of the company as a whole to manage those. And then moving on, the next one is audit teams are, I'll say, are slow, and audit plans are static. And this is by nature of the function, right? Audit organizations perform audit plans or audit planning for the next year, some for even more than a year, and these plans are put into place. They're reported to the audit committee and executives, and then the internal audit program or organization marches toward executing those audits. Well, these audits are very past-looking as opposed to forward-looking. And that's where audit engagements are performed, looking at performance of controls in the past, evaluating, testing. But this takes attention, time, and resources from the teams to away from looking at risks that are occurring at that time. Another is that there's always limited budget and resources. Audit teams are, ever since I was doing audits many years ago, always challenged with not having enough resources to execute their not only their audit plan, but adjustments that have to be made. Every time I've been in an audit function performing or leading audits, there are always new audits that come up, maybe a fraud that occurred, or maybe management wants audit to be part of a due diligence review or something like that. But that just puts more strain on resources, and I'll say one more strain is the specialized nature of risks and controls that need to be put into place. I think sometimes our audit teams aren't trained well enough or have that background to evaluate those new and complex risks. And then the last thing I'd say is audit groups are still very compliance-driven versus being risk-driven, and that is just complicated by the first bullet that I talked about. Like I said, these weren't necessarily challenges 10 years ago, but they are today. And I think with these changes, the industry isn't changing fast enough. I mean, methodologies are changing, COSO and others, for example, and I think some audit groups are changing their approaches, but it's certainly not happening at the speed of risk. And I'll just say one last thing is audit is typically focused on evaluating, when they are looking at risks, negative risks, what could go wrong, right? What has gone wrong. But a complaint audit has had throughout the years is they don't get a seat at the table with executives and being part of the strategic planning or just part of that strategic function. Well, they don't focus enough on positive risks, meaning what are the opportunities that the organization should take and be proactive about. And I think a lot of that's because of the bullets we talked about.
Well, I want to bring up a couple of data points, Patrick, and then get Kirk to weigh in on these challenges as well. The first one is one that you alluded to a couple minutes ago, and it was around what poses the greatest challenge. So this is from a 2017 report from KPMG talking to audit committees, and up on the left, 41% said the effectiveness of the risk management program posed the greatest challenge to their organizations. And I think obviously as we go through this presentation, we'll talk a lot about risk management and a lot about these challenges. The other survey, also from the same KPMG report, is around maximizing value, and you touched a little bit on that as well at the end there. 56% believe they can add value by expanding the audit plan on key areas of risk. 49% say they can expand the audit plan on the effectiveness of risk management processes. 53% said internal audit can best maximize value by being able to maintain more flexibility in the audit plan. Kirk, do you want to weigh in on any of these numbers or any of the challenges that Patrick's presented? Kirk, your line is muted right now. I'll remind you, so make sure you unmute.
Great.
There you go.
All right, beautiful, thanks. Now you'll all hear me. So I do want to go back, without going back in slides, I do want to go back to a point, the very first one, that is a rapidly changing risk environment. So there's two phrases there, rapidly changing risk environment, but actually the rapidly changing environment. So the organization used to be very contained. And what's really happening is the walls have disintegrated. The business is doing business outside of where they typically did. And they almost can't even tell the edge of that. So the changing risk environment is more than just the risk, it's actually the environment. The other thing I want to talk about is we introduced in the last bullet compliance. Now we messaged this as the integrating audit and risk webinar, but we didn't mention compliance specifically. But really, when you think about it, and I know that some of the statistics you just reviewed were around controls. So what's interesting is all of those functions, compliance, audit, and risk, all focus on controls. Because in the end, people don't manage risks. They manage the controls, and the controls manage risks. So as we go through the webinar, I want to revisit that concept, because the challenges and the estimate, I mean, the numbers were up and around the 34% around controls as how important are they through that survey. I think that actually tells the tale that if we can focus on that, it allows this common enemy of all the groups that is around controls.
All right, well, let's keep moving through. I want to talk about why these challenges exist. It's one thing to say these are the challenges, but I think it's useful to put some context in behind them. Patrick?
Well, this is complex, and we could go on for days, I think, on this, but a few that I'll key on and certainly ask for Kirk's opinion on this is one, I'll say industry inertia. And By industry inertia, I mean the internal audit industry. So it's really built into the way audits are done. For example, a couple of example audit teams, once they've done their audit planning and go out and execute an audit, they look at that entire audit engagement, I'll say, versus individual topics and risks. Now, there's some level of hopefully risk assessment that's done even once that audit is scheduled. So we're going to evaluate areas of highest risk and weed out the areas of lowest risk. But I think there's still some level of that lower risk being evaluated, those controls being tested just because it's part of the audit. But that that burns time and resources, and I think that keeps us from adjusting quickly and evaluating more critical risks. And another one is, let's say in heavily compliance-driven industries, internal audit groups sometimes have audit plans that span several years, not just the current year or the quarter. So really, how can you and I understand the need for this when it's a regulatory requirement. I mean, I'm not knocking that, but really, how can you react to risk this way when your resources are slated for those multi-year audit plans? And then just the process, I think, and the expectations. Audit plans are reported to the audit committee, and internal audit has to report back to them on status and justify any deviations. Well, dealing with a new risk or adjusting audit plans equals a deviation. And I'll tell you, having done this many times, it takes a lot of time to justify and prepare to even present that to the audit committee, and it burns resources all up and down the chain when you've got to do that. I think the second, like you've got there, is external auditor and regulatory or regulator expectations. One of the slides you just showed said 34% of auditors surveyed say regulatory compliance is a top challenge. Well, what this means to me is they've got a certain amount of audit work they've got to do during the year just to get the regulatory reviews done, whether that's Sarbanes-Oxley or industry specific. In an organization where there isn't a compliance group, that all falls on internal audit. And the regulators and the external auditors place a certain amount of pressure on internal audit to do this because they expect internal audit to cover off on those compliance obligations, evaluating those controls. And Kirk talked about the complexity and the changing environment, not just risk environment, but the organization itself. Well, regulations are changing too. Think of GDPR, as an example of one that's coming. Some of these are very new and technical and complex. And does internal audit really have the knowledge base and expertise to properly evaluate them? I think another challenge is what I'll call the independence challenge here. And audit has, in internal audit standards, there is the independence and objectivity standard where, the internal audit activity has to be independent and internal auditors must be objective in performing that work. So I think this creates a challenge in that some audit groups shy away from working together or leveraging or aligning with their operational risk groups or their compliance groups because they feel like they have that need for independence or that wall to be up. And maybe that expectation comes from regulators or external auditors. But really, if you delve into that standard, it really only says that they need to be free from conditions that restrict unbiased activities, and they've got to have direct access to senior management and the board, and they have to have an unbiased mental attitude and judgment. But nowhere does it say that you can't go above and beyond that to work on risk and compliance together. Then the last bullet, heavy regulatory burden. I think it really goes along with the second bullet there, and they'd mentioned SOX. But in heavily regulated industries, audit teams spend the lion's share of their time evaluating controls related to regulations and standards, and this could take up all of their time and really leave little for risk-based activities. So, just a few reasons I think, Glenn, that we have these challenges.
Kirk, do you want to jump in here?
I do. First of all, I want to retitle the slide because I think we called it "Why Do These Challenges Exist?" because we couldn't spell conundrum, but it really is. There's a lot of I guess conflicts going on in each one of these bullets. So inertia is a really interesting word. So going back to my old high school days, body in motion will remain in motion until acted upon by another force. So what I like to think, actually, anytime I consult with anybody, I like to challenge them why they continue to do things the way they are. I honestly think it's our job to shoulder check, literally knock this thing out of its motion to see if it still holds water. A lot of times you can't explain why things are done the way they are or who started it. And the reason it's such a conflict, and as Patrick said, the regulatory bodies, they expect things to be done a certain way because it takes you quite a while to develop a program, describe a program, and articulate it back to the regulators why they should trust you when you come up with this answer. So they don't want things to change. They like inertia. But as we described, this business is changing, the risk environment is changing. So how does a business change rapidly in an agile fashion, but still meet that regulatory burden? So that's why it's a conundrum. That's why that dichotomy exists. The independence challenge, so if I just put it on the table, the audit group has always struggled with how do we become part of the solution, because we're seen as these outsiders, right? We're seen as the third line of defense. But how do we become part of the team that actually does that? So what I would invite everybody to do is think about the inertia within their organization and how could they be a change agent? How could they shoulder check some of the things they are doing, not to the point where the regulators don't trust them anymore, but challenge the way things are done. Sometimes if you remove an item and nothing breaks, it's okay for that thing to be gone. And that's really, the conundrum about these challenges. Sorry, one more thing. I also think I want to use an analogy, and it is for people my age, I'm in the 50s, a school teacher in that era would almost try and surprise you. Remember the pop quizzes? They would come and they would surprise you with these questions, and their intent was to catch you and to prove that you weren't nearly as smart as what you thought you were. But that's not really helping people learn. So you fast forward to the teachers of today. And what they're really trying to do is they're trying to enable these children to learn as much as possible, and they coach them, they mentor them right up until exam day. And in fact, they're almost feeding them, these are the list of questions I'm likely to ask, and I want you to succeed. The mentality, the mindset is very, very different. So remember, audit wears this old teacher hat. It's not necessarily fair because audit has been evolving, but it's really tough to beat that inertia.
All right. Well, we're gonna keep exploring these topics as we go through, but I really wanted to shift to how we can evolve. And Kirk and Patrick, you've already started that discussion, but we're going to break this down into 5 areas. The first one is about integrating internal audit and GRC and what that means. Second one is we're going to look at the line of defense model and also how audit can better leverage the second line of defense. We'll look at developing dynamic risk-driven audit plans based on real-time risk and control data. We'll touch on continuous control monitoring as part of that discussion, and then we will look at data analytics, in particular some of the techniques for more effective reporting and communication. So I want to start with the first bullet, which is around this concept of GRC and integrated GRC. Patrick, I've thrown around that term a lot, GRC. What does it mean exactly? Can you define it? And what does integrated audit and GRC mean in your view?
Yeah, there's a number of terms. You mentioned a couple: GRC, integrated risk management. I'll add one more: operational risk management, because that's actually 2. Enterprise risk management is the last. But they all have some commonalities, like you've got here on the screen. Gartner, I think this is one of the more recent terms. They define integrated risk management as the integration of strategic, operational, and IT risk management across an organization. GRC, I really like OSEG's definition because they say governance, risk management, compliance are 3 related facets that help assure an organization reliably achieves objectives, addresses uncertainty, and then acts with integrity. And operational risk is I'd say more similar to integrated risk. but the things I like about that is it's defined as a really continual cycle or cyclical process, which includes risk assessment, decision making, controls, avoidance of risk. It talks about the human factors, the risk factors, et cetera. So, I think to get to your question, the integration of with internal audit and operational risk, or GRC, is there are other groups out there doing very similar things to internal audit, or things that internal audit cares about, right? And back to the independence issue, I don't think audit leverages these groups or works with them nearly enough.
Okay, Kirk.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump in. Since I retitled your last slide, I'm going to pick on the wording on the actual slide this time. The word integrated risk management. So it's an okay term, I think it's just okay, and we spent a lot of time talking about integrated risk management. I think it's required, but I'm going to just assume that if I were to ask everybody on the webinar and virtual nodding heads, have you ever had a discussion around silos, whether silos in the business are good or bad? I'm almost positive that everybody would nod yes. So what's the option to having silos? Having no silos? I've often suggested sometimes that, silos are okay as long as you only have one. But the truth is silos are required because organizations get too big functionally. They can't operate without these focused mandates. The trick is they can be integrated. You can integrate these silos, but the magic doesn't start to happen until you start to collaborate. So I would much prefer to see this as collaborative risk management, because we're talking about processes. We're talking about perhaps some systems in place. We're talking about sharing information. But in any workshop that I've ever delivered, the trick is not the systems and it's not the data. It is the people who have to share those and have to collaborate. So Patrick alluded to, working across these different groups. The OSEG definition I think was really good, because what it really insinuated was the system and the process is well defined, but it's not going to work until the people get involved. So I would much prefer collaboration be the center of a discussion like this, and honestly, anything to deal with operational risk management, enterprise risk management. Anytime you try and draw any one of these bubbles to another bubble, you need to collaborate. And that's an evolutionary type concept, because I think we spend a lot of time focused on just the word integration. So it's necessary, but I don't know if it's the actual key thing we should be discussing. And by the way, any successful implementations of a GRC program have always been on the backs of people who are willing to listen and willing to work, right? Because if we talk about the 3 lines of defense, wouldn't it make sense that the first knew about the second and the third, the second knew about the first and the third as well? So unless you're sharing information openly, it's really, really hard to do.
Hey, Kirk, I completely agree, and I would just add that it's got to work from the bottom up and from the top down. We've seen, I'm sure you have too in your engagements, where you've got a top-down mentality, and that has certain, good and bad connotations, and then you've got a grassroots, maybe culture, where things grow organically. Well, there's a good and bad to that. So I think unless there's some common meeting in the middle, it's tough to make that happen. But definitely agree with the collaboration point.
So collaboration, it's probably a good segue into the next topic we wanted to cover, which is around the lines of defense. Patrick?
Yeah, so this is a model that should be familiar to everyone, if at least if you're familiar with the audit standards, which this comes from the Institute of Internal Auditors. But really, the first line of defense, if you're not, is management. The owners of the processes, the products and services, the systems, really the owners of those controls and those really that should be managing those risks. And then the second line of defense are those GRC groups that we just talked about on the prior slide that really or the experts in each of those areas, risk, compliance, the third-party management, business resiliency, that are charged with implementing the standards and the practices and the procedures around each of those disciplines, helping the first line of defense to then implement and evaluate their own controls, self-assess, drive improvement, things like that. And then the third line is internal audit, who really needs to evaluate that second line of defense and get to the point where they are comfortable relying on them, leveraging them, and then independently evaluating risks and controls. And we don't talk about it as the fourth line of defense, but you can almost make the case that external audit and the regulators are that fourth line that have a similar role to internal audit, but they're much more independent. And then all that is reported up to senior management and the board. And what's not shown on this slide are, I'll say, corporate objectives, strategies, and even risk appetite that comes down from those governing bodies that should govern those three lines of defense. So, I think this model is pretty well known now, and to Kirk's point earlier about collaboration, this isn't the perfect way to get it done, but it's a good mechanism because this provides a common understanding of these different groups and how they can work together.
So I think definitely the topic of collaboration is one that's of a lot of interest to folks who are tuned in today. We've had a couple of questions come in the last couple of minutes, but specifically around collaboration. Patrick, you've presented this as one model to help drive better collaboration. Kirk, can you elaborate a little bit more? Any other any advice or techniques or tips that you've seen that are effective to build that story or that evolution into better collaboration?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd have to go back old school. I love technology as much as everyone else, but the way you really start to collaborate is you meet the people. And I understand travel is always an issue, but pull up a WebEx, get a meeting going, form a working group. But until you understand what the other person is really trying to achieve and the pressures they're under, it's really hard to get out of your own skin and understand what they are. One of the most successful collaboration workshops I've ever held was with 3 government departments. And there was a central agency responsible for delivering all services. There was essentially the officer of the government saying, here are your policies, and the other one was more or less representing senior leadership of the country. These people came to the table, and they couldn't agree on who had the biggest priority. So what we did is we played musical chairs. We literally took everybody out of their own skin, rotated them 1 degree, and we gave them somebody else's and a day in the life of. Within 10 or 15 minutes, they became to appreciate why their saying no impacted the next person down, why they needed to have a yes, why they needed information. So it's that appreciation. That would be the first thing I would say. The second is understanding that sometimes if we accept that business is dynamic and things are changing, just because you entered this mandate with this set of priorities, if you listened to their priorities, you would see at the organizational level why your number one isn't necessarily the overall number one. It's important and it needs to be addressed, but sometimes if you let somebody else go first, and if you let somebody else make a decision about a taxonomy, a scale of some sort, or maybe a way that findings are generated and communicated, sometimes you'll win on the back of them doing that hard work. You simply take that for a ride, and what happens is by you adopting some of theirs, reciprocity kicks in, and they feel obliged to help you be successful in your project. Remember, this first, second, and third line of defense is the end goal. Nobody wins if only 2 of those go across the finish line.
Well, I got to think it's a cultural change, and that is never a simple thing. I mean, but the breakthroughs you can achieve by finding that collaboration, by finding those common goals, can be really powerful to improving your audit program, your risk management program, your overall operations in a company.
Absolutely, and I add one more thing. So when I worked with a large bank in the last year, their first line people were like deer in the headlights. They had their day jobs, right? So remember, the business owns the risk. So that's why they're their first line of defense. They're the ones who develop the controls. But sometimes they're not risk professionals. So they need to support a second line to say, is this a good control? I've never built one before. I've never described one before. What framework do I have to report in? When do I need to report? So they get a lot of information and guidance from that second line of defense. It is critical for the success of first line. Now, if the third line is coordinated with the second line, then all it is an independent verification that what second told first was actually going to satisfy the risk management requirements for the organization.
Well, I want to move ahead, keep moving here. Our third point on the evolution was around agility, a shift to a more agile or dynamic, risk-driven approach to audit. I pulled a quote here from a recent PwC survey. These keywords I'm sure will resonate: speed, flexibility, getting the work done. They're all keywords we hear a lot from audit professionals. And I wanted to bring up a couple data points as well. So this is from a audit practitioner survey from a couple years ago. And what it found at the time was, 63% of audit groups update audit plans no more than twice a year. Only 15% said they had highly flexible plans. 31% don't update risk assessments, and only 21% deploy continuous risk assessments. Now, I want to contrast that. This is a different survey from 2017 this year, and they looked at organizations who had adopted a more agile approach to internal audit activities. So look at the contrast from the previous slide. 73% say they evaluate risk at the speed required by the business. 63% have increased the frequency of updates to their audit plans, and 47% have increased data analytics for continuous monitoring. I'll stop there and let Patrick or Kirk, if either one of you want to weigh in, what are you hearing from some of the organizations in these areas?
Well, I can jump in. I think the stats from your prior slide, 2015, are still very indicative of where the majority of today's internal audit organizations are. And I think the second slide, what that said to me is this is more about attributes of what an agile internal audit function really should be or really should do. And I think it enables them to do a couple of things. One, to adjust their plans quickly to evaluate emerging risks, really at the speed the business needs them to. This is going to help immensely with the challenge that internal audit teams have, and they've had from the beginning of time, and that is to be on the front end of strategy, of strategic decisions, to have that seat at the table. And then two, what this says to me is this is going to make their audit risk and control work more dynamic too. For example, dynamic risk assessments. It's going to make their work more directed and be able to do this through data analytics that finds that needle in the haystack, in thousands, if not millions of transactions. And then automated with that continuous control monitoring. And I think, these, like I said, help that audit group be more directed, take the busy work out of that testing that needs to be done, and lets them focus on higher priorities.
I would actually say the difference between the first slide, you don't have to go back and forth, but between the 63% about agility and then the benefits of agility, 73%, the way I interpret that is organizations don't necessarily have to be agile now. What they really need is the capability in place to become agile. Because remember, there's something we haven't really talked too much about yet, and that's culture. And we can't underestimate how important culture is. Even if we could move an audit program from the state it was 4 years ago, and if we could see the future out 8 more years, we couldn't do that in 1 year. The organization can't adapt that quickly. Not all organizations anyways, maybe some are capable. So what we're really talking about is developing capability to become agile, because the IIA and other groups will actually starting to build in some flexibility in the program. Soon you'll hear them talking about continuous monitoring. In fact, here it is in the third bubble here, 47%. Data analytics for continuous monitoring. So this whole idea about not the big bang program, but let's take the audit program and dissect it into much smaller pieces. That will allow them that agility because it comes very modular. So that's, I think, the way I interpret that is more about capability. The other one I'd like to say is when I talk to the CAEs is that they want to make sure that they're focused on the right things. So if they know what the right things are, but their program is not that agile to allow changes to happen, because your previous slide said 63% update no more than twice per year, that's a bit scary, because that means that even though they know that things have changed, the plan doesn't reflect that. And it's almost like when you let a contract, it's more costly to change the contract and pay the penalty than just let it execute and let it actually finish off. So if we change the mindset, again, back to mindset, then we can change this view about agility.
It's the culture point, Kirk, is interesting. I wanted to mention this a couple slides back, and I'll just chime in now. I think audit, internal audit gets frustrated sometimes with the culture, but the culture of audit being the outsider. Let's say that. I think that's how you put it a couple slides back, and I think back to my career when I was in an audit function for a very large financial organization. We had that school teacher mentality for a long time, where we were trying to catch people doing things wrong and write those findings up, and we realized that was not the right culture to really get to the meat of issues and to help the business own the controls and risk, and to really report the things that should be reported, and both positively and constructively. So when we realized as an audit function that we could impact that culture by our approach, things really started to change, and we got much more collaboration with our auditees and our counterparts, for example, in the compliance group. So I think that would be some advice on collaboration: is look at the culture inside the audit organization itself, and you can impact that, and it does a lot of good.
Yeah, that's good advice. I want to move on next to visibility and reporting, and really this is about communication. So we hear often from organizations who are looking for help to provide more forward-looking reports, or more visual, more dynamic dashboards and infographics versus what's often traditionally dense or complex reporting. Kirk, how can a GRC solution have an impact in this area?
So I like the way the graph is laid out, because it sort of shows the way static is opposed to dynamic, and today and the future, because things are changing. And if we think about evolving the organization and accepting that there's silos, but they need to work together, the best view, I'm going to say the simplest view, if you just get one silos view and one functions view. So let's do audit within the finance silo. That it's interesting, but it provides not nearly as much context as if you join perhaps the risk management and the finance group together with HR, and you look at the audit across a process that stripes all three of those functions. That becomes a much more interesting view, because what it really says, in order for us to deliver this process, these things have to be true. Remember, nobody finishes in a team, nobody finishes the race until they all finish the race. And if we add all of the silos or functions within a business, it would hold true then that we need to at least consider, does a silo participate in the end-to-end view? If they do, what is your status? And to use a bit of an analogy, if anybody remembers the old graphic equalizers, so there's, say, 20 little sliders that move up and down. The curve of risk for a certain process that's key to a business is different across all of those different silos. And then you take the second process, it looks a little bit different, but you don't get that view until you actually consider the value or the value chain that lays across your organization. That's where audit, I think, will truly find its value and we're focused on visibility and reporting. That's why I think the dynamic nature of a process, it can ebb and flow, but unless the processes that support the first, second, and third line of defense to evaluate how or what the risk level is it within tolerances, I don't know that we're actually going to achieve that until we actually start to, again, collaborate.
Okay. I want to go back to the very first slide we had up around challenges, just to recap here. Thought it might be useful before we get into the last part of the conversation. You know, we've talked about changing risk environment, the need for speed and agility, shift towards forward-looking engagements, budget and resources, and a shift to become more risk-driven. So I want to shift the conversation a bit more specifically to GRC solutions like RSA Archer and how organizations are using these tools. And Kirk, let's start with you. You're working with a lot of organizations who are implementing GRC solutions for their audit management. Walk us through some of the success criteria or requirements that they have for those programs.
Yeah, so you used a term I love, and that's success criteria. And I know there's a few people that I've worked with on the webinar, and bear with me again because I sort of get on my soapbox when I talk about that. It really is, what do you want to achieve out of your program? And I see these bubbles as sort of those things out of many of the workshops that I've done. And it really is, where are we today and how will the world be better tomorrow? What can't we do today that we should be able to do tomorrow? And it's in simple layman's terms. It's not complicated. It's not a features list. So even though we talk about platforms to support the process, it isn't those things. It really is things like, I want to be able to base my audit on a risk prioritization. And the risks, as we've talked about, risk environment is dynamic now. So those things change. So again, I see this as capabilities. So I want the capability to be able to prioritize and reprioritize what is included in my audit. Of course, everybody's after efficient, but I would argue don't make it efficient until it's effective, right? Peter Drucker said there's nothing so useless as not doing that which should never have been done at all. And I think it really holds true. Because why make it faster if it doesn't work in the first place? So effective first, then efficient. And then I also talk about impact. What other things that are maybe tangible or intangible to the organization. Fewer workarounds, I think that makes sense because you could talk about lean engineering, you could talk about process re-engineering, but simply if it takes you 20 steps to do today and you can bring in some technology to help you in the future and build QA, and I heard that phrase recently, and I love that phrase because as you start to use some of this automation and technology, you actually build in some of those quality controls within that, and it also brings in some of those handoff points and make sure that those are tracked. Visibility reporting, we just talked about that. I'm not going to rehash that. Enable self-serve, a lot of the time that the teams have is, where are you at? Where are you at? Where are you at? And it really is, if we can provide a capability for people to not ask people, but ask the system or a solution, where are we at? Those things are really progress bars. And they just need to know where they are. So also, you don't know what their mandate is. They maybe have been tasked to go off and build a presentation for an executive meeting, and they don't really want to talk to you. They just want the information you have. So if they can enable that, that's a huge win. Tracking of issues and findings. If we're talking to an audit group, finding has an entirely different connotation than the way we may use it. I always say to people, think of things as observations first and then promote them to issues and promote them to findings, especially in the audit world. That has a special meaning. Integrating the functions, as we talked about, these are the silos. And these are only 3 of the N silos. So I think that if we had something that had an integrated mechanism that supported collaboration, then we've actually hit a home run on that one. And then, of course, all of this is about demonstrating due diligence to a regulator, and honestly, that's what a regulator wants. And I'd be interested in Patrick's view on this, confirmation or otherwise, is sometimes the regulator, they don't want specific things to be in place. They want you to have achieved an objective. And if you can show an alternative way, or in PCI lingo, a compensating control, they're fine. It's really the spirit of what they are requiring that you need to be able to do. So the ability to demonstrate that is a huge win as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the right approach. I think it depends on the regulator and the industry, Kirk. But if you can get to that point with your regulators, I think that's a home run, because that's, as an objective or an organization, that's what you're trying to achieve anyway, and that trickles down. That really is a good message, I think, and I think this helps with the culture down to that first line of defense and the second, but especially the first two. This is our objective, right? You achieved it that way. We would have achieved it the other way, but it got us there, and that really does wonders for your culture. But that I think is a more mature relationship with the regulators and external auditors that you've got to get to, and I've seen it in with some regulators and others not so much. But yeah, good point.
If I could just add one more point, Glenn. I think if anybody's familiar with Napoleon Hill, he's from 1936. He's no longer with us, but he wrote How to Think and Grow Rich. He had a phrase which I love, and he was telling a story about somebody asking the time, and he says, well, it's purported to be 12 afternoon, and the reason the point he was trying to drive home was, how do you know? Is it your time zone? But he wanted to know, how do you know? And we use phrases colloquially all the time. So if any of these resonate, or if you've ever heard any of these, nod your virtual head. Have you ever been told to get a second opinion? Have you ever been told, don't believe everything you hear? Or if you don't believe me, ask so-and-so. Measure twice, cut once, anybody who's a carpenter. And then the one I love is used by Reagan, trust but verify. So I think these really do demonstrate that we all practice what audit does informally, but we all do it in our own personal lives. So why, when we get to work, are we so offended that this independent body is coming along behind us just to make sure that we did what we're supposed to do? Interestingly enough, if you've ever flown an airplane, the person who you want using a checklist for landing and takeoff is not the young guy. He's so eager to get up there and fly an airplane, he's all over everything. It's the older guy. It's the guy who's been doing this for 30 years, because guess what? He's been doing it for 30 years. They're the ones who tend to say, don't tell me. I know I've done this so many times I could tell you in my sleep. That's the guy I want using a checklist. That's the guy I want having an independent or a peer review about how that goes. So I really do think if we all change our mindset, and I'm talking to the groups that are probably within risk and compliance, to accept the audit group in, and the audit group to present themselves that way, this is where the collaboration comes from.
All right. A theme in this call today has really been around visibility, collaboration, breaking down the silos. Patrick, we wanted to explain RSA Archer, I guess, in that context. Can you comment a bit on that, on the way that Archer, again, can play towards that desire for better collaboration?
Yeah, you bet. So earlier we talked about the three-line of defense model, and it really only goes so far in applicability without an automated solution, and that's what Archer, I think, does for us. A GRC solution. If you look at the groups here, we talked about them as part of the GRC slide. But really, in order to move forward, a system like Archer will perform a lot of those mundane tasks automatically, like freeing up audit risk compliance teams to do more forward-looking thinking and analysis. I think where it helps also with collaboration is the built-in workflow for each line of defense function allows them to do their job and then correlate with the other lines of defense where it makes sense. So it has some structure. It's certainly risk-driven, which addresses several of those 5 challenges we talked about earlier. And I think a really key point here is it's holistic, meaning this. Let me give you an example. It sees how, or allows us to see how audit, for an example, is tied to the other I'll call function. So example, and where this visibility and collaboration really comes in is when, let's say, operational risk creates and analyzes a risk that has third-party resiliency implications. Well, then both that third-party group, as you can see on the slide, and business resiliency, let's say they get a notification and they have visibility into that new risk. So they then apply their expertise in dealing with it and managing that residual risk to an acceptable level. And then internal audit, in turn, sees the risk quickly if it's a high risk, or maybe they see it during their next audit of the third-party governance of the business resiliency function, and allows them to test those controls around that risk. Maybe unless the compliance group's already done that. So it allows just a high degree of organized collaboration, I'll say, back to Kirk's point, versus integration. And then the last point I'll key on is visibility. A couple slides ago we talked about that and how reporting is so critical to that. So the reporting that you get out of a system like this is two things: real time. So that reporting you see, having done this many times without a GRC tool, reporting up to the audit committee or executives takes hours and hours of work. But with the GRC tool, the data is real time and the reporting engine is built in, and you can generate very good reports at the click of a button. And then the other thing I'll say is the visibility comes through this structure from those correlations that can be reported and analyzed because of the cross-reference information in the tool. Like, a risk might be linked to 3 findings from 3 different audits, or a host of other information that allows internal audit or compliance to analyze that differently and certainly more holistically. So just a couple thoughts there.
All right, well, we're almost coming up to our time. We'll wrap it up on this slide. I wanted to give both of you just maybe a minute or so just for some final thoughts. Our original question today was, how do we integrate audit and GRC to help evolve beyond the third line? Kirk, maybe start with you. Just some final thoughts on the discussion today and what we've covered.
Yeah, so without rehashing, I think Patrick did a great job explaining the platform. So I would add 2 things. One is it's about making better business decisions, and each day they get better and better, so that real-time view about what things are at in that current state would absolutely make that happen. The other one is this is a litmus test I'd send everybody away with as homework. And does your current solution deliver the so what and the so what now? Very simple terms, but it's a really easy test. So if you're not able to see the so what, and if you don't know what to do when you see it, that's the test. So that's all I had to add. Yeah.
Patrick, last word over to you.
Yeah, I'll agree with Kirk on the objectives, and I'll call these 4 guiding principles that really should be top of mind when you're integrating audit with your other GRC functions. And just to key on a couple of these, we didn't talk a whole lot about it today, but accountability equals ownership. We have a tagline at RSA that says inspire everyone to own risk, right? Which really needs to be true in any organization, whether they've employed the third line of defense model or not. But collaboration, I think we talked a lot about. We talked about analytics, driving visibility, and I think this helps better decisions being made. And we talked about the effectiveness and then efficiency. Well, automation can drive that efficiency once that effective process is put in place. And it's not just automation in one of the silos like audit or GRC, but GRC automation that pulls these groups together on one platform and really drives that collaboration, creates accountability, and delivers that visibility.
All right. Well, thanks to both of you. Kirk, final thought, Kirk?
No, sorry. I think that's good.
I thought you were going to jump in.
No.
We're almost at our time. So before we wrap up, I want to give a quick plug for Iceberg's Risk Intelligence Academy. You can visit icebergnetworks.com, follow the links, and you'll find an ebook series called Getting Started with GRC. And in the coming weeks, we'll be adding more resources, toolkits, and best practices to help organizations on their GRC journey, whether it's an internal audit journey or any of the other segments that we talked about. As I mentioned earlier, a copy of today's deck and a video recording will be posted on our website at icebergnetworks.com/audit webinar. We'll have that up later today. If you're interested in diving into this topic some more with Kirk or Patrick, or you'd like to set up a demo of the RSA Archer audit management solution, you can email us at info@icebergnetworks.com or give us a call. I'd like to send a big thank you to Patrick and Kirk for the discussion today. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in for today's webinar. We appreciate your time and attention and questions, and we hope that this was a useful presentation for you. So on behalf of Iceberg, I'm Glenn Gower. Looking forward to talking with you soon. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks.